Hi, thank you so much for joining me today.
Sure. Hi,
To start off, what is your name?
Sabrina.
Sabrina. And Sabrina, you're going to tell me a little bit about your family, specifically your son. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And what was his name?
Dean.
Dean. All
Yes.
right. And did Dean have any siblings?
Dean had one sibling, Ellen. She
Oh,
is now 7.
wow.
Yes.
Okay.
And she's
Um,
a typical child.
your typical child.
Yes.
That means wild and crazy and cute
Yes.
as a button.
Yep. And no medical diagnoses, thank goodness.
Yes, we like that. Okay, so tell me a little bit about Dean. What was his primary diagnosis, or did he have one?
So that's hard to answer. He didn't
Okay.
have like one single primary diagnosis. So it might be easiest if I just give a little history here.
Sure.
Okay. So Dean, starting from the beginning, typical normal pregnancy, not a normal birth, but not important. But after he was born, he was breathing too fast, and because he had some fluid in his lungs, and because of that, he got sent to the NICU. And in the NICU, the doctors noticed some slight craniofacial abnormalities. Like his eyes were wide, and his bridge of his nose was wide, and just his mouth was small, little things like that. And so because they knew that that could be indicative of issues, they did an ultrasound of his brain and his heart. And his heart was fine and normal. But when they did the ultrasound of his brain, they discovered that he was missing a structure in the brain called the corpus callosum. And it's a little structure that sits right in the middle of the brain. And it's basically the communication highway that allows the two halves of the brain to communicate with each other. And so he didn't have one at all. And that just meant that the communication between the two halves of his brain was going to be really challenging.
Okay.
So that was how it started. So we found that out the day after he was born. Prior to that, as far as we knew, everything was normal. So that was how it started. We didn't really know what that would mean for his future. We did a bunch of research, and what we found was that kids with agenesis of the corpus callosum, which is the fancy name, had a wide range of outcomes. So some of them could be fairly complex, with a lot of different medical issues. But then on the other end, you could have somebody who seemed almost completely normal, but maybe socially awkward. And
Okay.
so we just knew that there was this huge range and there was no way to predict, and we just would have to wait and see. But from there, things got worse. It turned out Dean couldn't eat. He couldn't swallow milk properly. So he stayed in the NICU for that while they were trying to get that sorted out. He had an NG tube through his nose down into his stomach. After about 5 weeks with no progress, we made the decision to go ahead and have the G-tube surgery. And so at 5 weeks old, he had a G-tube placed. And a few days after that, he was released from the NICU and came home. So we had a G-tube baby at home. And Dean is the younger of our children, by the way. He's 2 years younger than Ellen.
Okay.
So Ellen was 2 when Dean came home.
So you had your hands full. You had
Yes.
a
We had it.
baby and a
Yes.
toddler.
Yes.
Wow. Okay.
And not only that, but Dean had his days and nights backward. And the reason that's important is because while he was awake, he did nothing but cry or scream. There was never awake and calm. That didn't exist. So he was either asleep or he was crying and screaming. And since he had his days and nights backwards, what that meant was he cried and screamed throughout the entire night. So what we did is for the first 2 weeks that we were home, we had a grandmother stay with us. And grandmother, myself, and my husband, Justin, would take shifts through the night to sit up holding a crying, screaming baby, trying to feed him every 3 hours with a G-tube, which was a disaster.
Wow.
And so usually Justin would take the first shift from 10 to 1. And then I would take the middle shift because I was mom. So I got the middle shift from 1 to 4. And then grandma would take the last shift from 4 to 7. And then by 7, Ellen was up and we had the day.
Wow.
And so, and Dean had to be fed every 3 hours because he was an infant, right, through his G tube. But the whole process of getting the food ready, getting it through the tube, getting everything cleaned up, that whole process took about an hour. And so there was only 2 hours in between starting that over again, all
Wow.
day and night. So it was really, really rough. And it got worse from there. So some things got better. He did start to have, like, after about 2 weeks, he would have maybe 5 minutes of the whole day where he was awake and calm.
Okay.
And so they were like, the most amazing 5 minutes of all time. And that slowly, like, improved. But we went through a lot of stuff. He had a lot of problems with feeding. He didn't tolerate breast milk, then he didn't tolerate the formula. And so we ended up on a completely elemental formula that made a big difference. And that was the first time that he, like, started smiling. So when he was 3 months, we did start getting some of the little smiles. But that would not have happened without the formula change. But Dean, on top of all of his issues, was colicky. And so, like, it was hard to distinguish if he was crying because of colic or if he was crying because there was something wrong. And so we were frequently at the GI doctor, and the GI doctor at some point told us, like maybe when he was 3 or 4 months old, told us, like, look, there is no way to know what's going on here. You're just gonna have to come back when he's 6 months old, and we'll try again. Yeah, because he just cried all the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's hard on the entire family. That's
Indeed.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. So obviously, my maternity leave was extended. Originally my plan had been to go back to work after 11 weeks. That's what I did with my daughter, and put her in daycare. And it took a little bit longer than that for Dean, but we did actually find a special needs daycare to put him in that I loved. I spent like an entire week there all day, every day with the babies in the room, like seeing how they took care of them and training them how to take care of Dean, because he was really hard to soothe. And so it was like, had to train them on the feeding tube, but also on how to soothe them. And so we did that, and we did actually get him put in a daycare.
Do you mind saying what that daycare is for other
Not at
families?
all. That was Emerson Academy in Round Rock. Yeah, it's on Gaddis School Road in Round Rock. Wonderful. And they were terrific. Like, I cannot say enough good things about Emerson Academy.
Wonderful. That's always, people are always looking for special needs.
True story. I didn't even think about that, because we did a lot of research to try to find a place, and it was hard. But I loved Emerson Academy. They were wonderful. So, like, highly recommend.
Keep that on this video.
Yeah. I guess I'm just going to go through his story. Like I said, interview, but anyway.
No, yeah, just keep going.
Okay. So I tried to go back to work while he went to daycare, but when he'd only been there a month, I guess. And so he was like just shy of 4 months old, and he caught his first cold, which is a thing, right? Kind of what babies do. And the problem was, when he caught his first cold, he went into respiratory distress and we had to go to the hospital. Okay. And when we were at the hospital, he was showing that he was apneic when he was asleep. Like, he would stop breathing for periods of time while he was asleep. And he had been doing that already before the cold. And I'd actually asked his pediatrician about that. We just had a normal pediatrician, my daughter's pediatrician, who I love. She's great, but doesn't have a lot of experience with complex kids. And I had asked her about it, and I had shown her, Dean was asleep one day while I was there, and I'd shown her, like, he does this, like, this seems weird to me. Do I need to be worried? And she said, well, he does have these craniofacial abnormalities, but he seems like, yeah, I see what you're talking about, but he seems comfortable still, so I wouldn't worry about it. So we didn't. Okay. But when we were in the hospital with the cold and the respiratory distress and they saw it, they were worried. So we were there for a few days until he got better, but they told us to come back like in a week for a follow-up appointment with a craniofacial specialist, because they wanted to reevaluate him when he wasn't sick. So we went back, it was like a Monday, and we went to the office at Strictly Pediatrics, the building next to Dell, to see the craniofacial doctor. And Dean was asleep while we were there, and he was still doing his normal thing, and they saw it and immediately took us through the tunnels to Dell Children's and admitted him to the PICU right there.
Wow.
Because they were concerned about his apnea while he was asleep. And so they did a sleep study in the PICU and discovered that he stopped breathing 59 times in 1 hour.
Wow.
Yep. So they figured out that it was because his jaw was recessed. It meant that when he fell asleep, his tongue kind of fell back and caused his epiglottis to block the airway. And so they decided that the best course of action would be a surgery called a jaw distraction, where they cut the jaw, put hardware on there, and then over the course of a period of days, slowly crank the hardware like an expander in the mouth and bring the jaw forward. And you do it a little bit at a time so that the bone can fill in and grow in. And so they ended up over a period of 8 days, brought his jaw forward by 1.5 centimeters.
Wow.
And yeah. And then you leave the hardware in place for 6 weeks after that for the bone to harden, and then you get it removed.
During those 8 days, was he awake? Because that sounds like a really painful procedure. I'm just wondering.
This part is hard.
Yeah.
So no.
Okay.
He was intubated.
Okay.
It was not safe to extubate him until his jaw was brought forward enough because of the apnea, because of the obstruction. So because he was intubated, that meant he had to be completely sedated. But Dean fought through drugs really badly. Okay. So he had to be on a pretty high dose of a sedative and a painkiller and a paralytic, because he also had to be still for, to make sure that everything was safe, right, with the intubation. And I won't lie, the paralytic scared the crap out of me, because he couldn't move. There would be no way for him to indicate if there was something wrong, right? And so he was in the, obviously he was in the PICU. He was very good care. Everything was great, but it was a really rough 8 days for me.
Well, it's terrifying. Yeah. You didn't have a sick baby before, so this is all new.
Yes, it was rough. It got worse because in my head, I thought that when we made it through that period and they extubated him, that we'd be over the hump and things would be getting better from there.
Right.
And that's not what happened. And the reason is because he basically developed addiction to the drugs that he'd been on over that period of time. And that's not uncommon, but what was uncommon was how difficult it was to wean him off the drugs. Most babies, or people, I guess, in general, even when they form this addiction after a surgery like this in this, period of time, there's this process they can follow for a wean. It takes, a few days, maybe a week, and then they're fine, and that's that.
Right.
And with Dean, every time they tried to wean him down, and the big problem was the Versed, actually. The fentanyl, which was the painkiller, we were able to get him off of. The Versed was the sedative, and that was the one that we were having trouble weaning. And every time they would try, he would just get so agitated and upset, and just, really upset. And they have this score sheet, basically, where they keep track of withdrawal symptoms and mark scores based on how many symptoms there are. And so if your score is so high, then you'll get a rescue dose of the medicine, and they won't wean until the score comes down. And what was happening was Dean's score was never coming down. We were just always giving these rescue doses and never able to bring the real thing down. And it got so bad that one of the elements of that scoring is the agitation that Dean had. And it got so bad that the doctor decided just to discount that completely from his scorecard, no longer considered agitation as a withdrawal symptom at all because they couldn't wean him otherwise. And so it took about 2 weeks in the hospital with more time out of the hospital, but to be able to be weaned enough that we could get on G-tube meds at home as opposed to the IV meds in the hospital. That took about 2 weeks. And Dean was just really upset the whole time. So I used to just sit on his hospital bed and just hold a crying, screaming baby for hours. Like that was just my life. I would just sit on a hospital bed and hold his crying. Like that was just that was it. I lived at the hospital with him. I was not working, obviously. I had at this point I had to take leave of absence from work because that whole thing, that jaw distraction and drug wean, that whole thing he was in the hospital for a total of a month.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yep. So he was finally released. He was 5 months old by this point, and was doing better. He still had his jaw distractors in, but he was doing better with his sleep. He was breathing. We sent him back to daycare. I tried to go back to work. About 2 weeks after that, I got a call from the daycare worker that there had been a fall. The worker was holding Dean and she was trying to step over a gate instead of opening the gate. And she fell and she just landed on her bottom and she protected Dean. He didn't, she just held him and, he didn't hit anything. He was fine. It was a really pretty minor fall for her. But in the process of holding him to her to keep him safe, he ended up, I guess with a leg twist, and he ended up with a spiral fracture of the femur.
Oh.
Yep. Fully fractured all the way through. The x-ray was crazy. So we were back in the hospital for that. He was too small for a cast. So they put him in a hip dysplasia harness to stabilize the leg. And we were told that he would just need to wear this hip dysplasia harness for 6 weeks. Actually, I guess this happened about 1 week after he was released, something like that. Yeah. And so he would have to wear this hip dysplasia harness for 6 weeks. Okay. So he's still at daycare. Now he's in a hip dysplasia harness, but he's doing okay. I've tried to go back to work again.
Okay.
Catches his second cold right before 6 months old. And he goes into respiratory distress again. So we're back in the hospital again. This time they determined that he had a floppy airway. And so his whole airway would just collapse on him when he would be asleep because he started obstructing. I guess I didn't mention that. Over the course of that month that he was out of the hospital, he slowly started having these apneic episodes while he was asleep again. And it was getting steadily worse. Okay. And everything came to a head when he got his second cold and we were in the hospital. Okay. And he got so bad that every time he would fall asleep, he would within a minute desat to the 60s. His oxygen saturation would just fall to 60%, which is not sustainable.
No.
And they didn't intubate him, but they had him on high flow oxygen, and they had him on this wedge where he would lay on his stomach in order to let gravity hold his airway open while he was asleep. And but it was clear that if we didn't do something drastic, he was going to die basically because he just couldn't breathe. So he got trached. That was when we made the decision with the doctor's recommendation to get a trach.
Okay.
So he got his trach 1 day shy of 6 months old. That hospital stay again was a month. The reason for that was the last 2 weeks of it was training for my husband and me on how to take care of a trach baby. Yep. We had to learn how to clean the stoma, which we at least had practiced cleaning a G-tube stoma.
Right.
But we had to learn how to clean a trach stoma without letting the trach fall out. We had to change the trach ties. And once a week, we had to change out the whole trach. So we had to learn how to do that, which was terrifying. Yeah. And so that process, takes 2 weeks to get all of that figured out. And then they also won't release you from the hospital unless you've got home health nursing. So we had not prior to that had home health nursing, but we went home from the hospital that time with home health nursing. Okay. So that is 6 months old. We're adjusting to home health nursing and more supplies being delivered to our house than I could have ever fathomed. Boxes a month of supplies, just filling our house with supplies, which was also an adjustment. And we're doing our thing. I think I tried to go back to work again.
Yeah.
I really wanted to work.
Was your boss and your company, were they being pretty good about it?
Super understanding and accommodating. Yeah, they were great. Yes, they were great. So no complaints there.
Good.
But now going back to work was not working out because the nurses at home taking care of Dean were still having trouble soothing him. He still just would not soothe easily. And so Dean was kind of miserable all the time. I started having panic attacks all the time, worrying about him.
Yeah.
I was not able remotely to focus on work.
No.
And I decided I just needed to quit altogether. So I did. I quit my job and decided to stay home with Dean and help. And it was absolutely the right thing to do. I never wanted to be a stay-at-home mom. I still don't want to be a stay-at-home mom. But it was necessary and I had no regrets about it. It was what we needed to do for our family.
Yep.
So during all of this time, we're seeing the geneticist because they were fairly certain that Dean's issues were genetic in nature. But they had done all of the genetic panels in the NICU and everything had come back normal. Actually, at first they thought he might have had a mitochondrial disorder, which would have been horrible, because
Right.
he would just not have lived very long. But everything kept coming back normal. So finally, our geneticist decided to do whole exome sequencing for him. Just do the whole thing and figure out what comes back.
Okay.
So when he was, I guess 8 months old, maybe like 8.5 months old, the whole exome sequencing came back. And we learned that he had 3 genetic mutations that were most likely contributing to all of his issues.
3.
So let me just go through this.
Yeah.
Yes. One of them was inherited. The other 2 were just random, unlucky genetic mutations.
Wow.
Okay. The worst of them was one of the random ones, not inherited. And there's actually a syndrome associated with that. So he was at this point diagnosed with a syndrome called MRD13, which stands for mental retardation autosomal dominant 13 with neuronal migration defects.
Wow.
Isn't that a mouthful?
That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So basically what it means is that the brain doesn't develop properly in utero. The way your brain develops, I learned all of this, is that your neurons basically like start in the center and then have to migrate to their appropriate locations to be in their final spots. And this disorder means that process doesn't work right. And so it's common to end up with either a partial corpus callosum or, in Dean's case, this more severe case, a complete lack of the corpus callosum in the brain. And then just other general brain abnormalities, right? Like the reason it's called mental retardation is because these children do not have typical brains.
Right.
So as part of that syndrome, so I don't know how much you know about genetics, but there's a genotype and a phenotype.
Okay.
So bear with me here for a moment.
Yep.
The genotype is the actual gene mutation itself. The phenotype is how that presents in the person.
Okay.
So it is possible to have one genotype, one gene mutation with multiple phenotypes. It presents differently in different people.
Yep.
It's also possible to have a single phenotype that can come about by multiple different gene mutations.
Okay.
In Dean's case, this gene mutation had multiple phenotypes associated with it. Dean had the most rare of those phenotypes. There's only like 13 cases worldwide documented in the literature of this phenotype.
Okay.
And it's the phenotype is what was called MRD13.
Okay.
And we learned that as part of that, he was most likely also going to have movement challenges, which he did. He didn't have muscle coordination. His muscle tone fluctuated in and out. You know, he, by this point, he's 6 months old and or 8 months old, and he's not rolling over yet. Like, he couldn't sit up, you know, so that was true. But we also learned that most of the time these children would develop epilepsy. So at this point, Dean had not had any seizures, but we learned that we should expect that they would start.
Okay.
So that's the first gene mutation.
First of three, right? Okay.
Yes. The second one was inherited. It's an autosomal dominant gene that presents differently if you have one copy versus two, because it has like a syndrome if you have the two recessives.
Okay.
Or the two copies, I guess, makes this like one syndrome. But if you only have one copy, you end up with this different presentation.
Okay.
Dean had one copy. My husband and I were both tested as part of all of this. We each also have one copy.
Okay.
So one of us gave it to him. There's no way to know which one. And it didn't present at all in Justin or me. But having only a single copy of this one gene is not that big of a deal. It means your teeth don't form properly.
Okay.
So, or you could be missing teeth. My teeth are all perfectly normal. Justin is missing one tooth.
Okay.
And otherwise, but both of our teeth are shaped normally.
Okay.
Dean's teeth were not. Dean was missing a bunch of teeth, and he had conical shaped teeth. They were like little shark teeth, really sharp. You didn't want to catch your finger in his mouth, that's for sure.
Okay.
And that came from this gene. Okay. The third gene mutation, also random, was not officially known to be disease-causing, but was not known not to be disease-causing, if that makes sense.
Okay.
It was known to play a role in the development of the skin and the immune system. Dean also had skin problems. He couldn't sweat properly, so he overheated all the time, which took us a while to learn and was interesting given that his favorite place ever was outdoors in Texas heat. The only way we could make that work was to stay in the shade and spray him down with water at all times. He just had to have wet skin. That was the only way he could stay cool.
Wow.
Yep. But the geneticist thinks that those second two genes, the one that caused his teeth issue, okay, hold on 1 second. Back up for a second. The one that caused the teeth issue, if you have both copies of that gene, you end up with something called ectodermal dysplasia, which is a skin disorder. Dean, by symptoms alone, was diagnosed with ectodermal dysplasia, but the genetics don't match that.
You only had one. Okay.
Yes. The geneticist thinks that that one copy combined with this third gene mutation worked together to cause ectodermal dysplasia.
Okay.
Okay. Whew.
Yeah. All right. Had all
Okay.
going on.
I know. He was so complex.
Yeah.
Okay. Fast forward 2 weeks.
Okay.
He has his first seizure. 2 weeks to the day after we got these diagnoses from the geneticist, he has his first seizure. And he didn't just have one seizure, he kept having seizure after seizure after seizure. So we were back in the hospital. So now he's closely being followed by a neurologist. on top of the gastroenterologist and the dermatologist and the geneticist,
Probably
and the
pulmonologist.
pulmonologist.
Yeah.
Yes. Now we also he already was seeing the neurologist because he had brain malformation. So that was already a thing, but now it's even more of a thing because now he has seizures.
Okay. Never a dull moment.
No. I'm afraid by this point, our whole life is me trying to keep panic attacks at bay and always waiting for the next shoe to drop because it always did.
So what was life like? I mean, you still have a healthy toddler at home,
Yep.
a marriage, you've got family in town. And
Yep.
was family kind of just helping with Ellen, and you and Justin were just in survival mode trying to figure all this out?
That's pretty accurate.
Yeah. Okay.
Ellen was still in preschool. And so we continued to send her to preschool.
Right.
She had a fairly normal life still.
Good.
She loved Dean. Dean loved her.
Aw.
Dean couldn't play in a typical way, but he definitely, once he got trached, I didn't say this part. Once he got trached, Dean turned into a whole new kid. So that first 6 months of his life before the trach, he was so unhappy. He just cried all the time. He was just miserable. Well, guess what? It turns out it's because he couldn't breathe.
Right.
And it just took us that long to figure out that's what was going on.
Right.
Once he got trached, he was like a whole new kid. He was so happy. He smiled all the time. He laughed all the time. Let me tell you about Dean's first laugh. We were in the hospital at the time, because Dean was always in the hospital. So we were in the hospital at the time. He had a PICC line in his head, and it was just me and him hanging out in his room, and I was holding him, and I was just giving him kisses. And so I would kiss his face, and he just, for the first time ever, I kissed his face, and he bust out laughing.
Oh.
And it was just the cutest thing on earth. So I kissed him again. He bust out laughing again. And it was so consistent. I was actually able to get it on video.
Oh.
So I have video of Dean's first time laughing because I would just kiss him and cackle, 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 kiss, cackle, 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 cackle. This was actually right before he was trached. We were in the hospital, but he hadn't yet been trached.
Okay.
But he still managed to find his first laugh in this moment. And after he was trached, he just laughed all the time. It sounded different. I only have the one video of Dean cackling. It was like a full-blown cackle. But after the trach, it was breathy, right? You can't talk well with the trach.
Right.
And so, afterwards his laugh was, but it was still laughter. His whole face lit up and it was still adorable. And he was so, he just laughed and smiled all the time. Even with all the things going on, he was just the happiest kid on earth. I used to call him my sunshine because he just brightened up every room. And anytime I was having a bad day or I was in a bad mood, I would just pick up Dean and kiss him. Or I would tickle him. He was the most ticklish kid on the face of the planet. I'm not even kidding. You could touch the back of his head and he was laughing. His normal babies might be ticklish, on their ribs and on their feet, right? And on their belly. Dean was ticklish on the back of his head, on the palms of his hands, on his back, everywhere. And so that was my favorite thing to do was just tickle him all day long. And so if I was grumpy or in a bad mood, all I had to do was go pick up Dean and give him some kisses and listen to him laugh and then tickle him and listen to him laugh some more. Everything was better.
Aww.
Everything was better.
Love it.
Yeah. And Ellen used to sing him songs and he loved that. We had to do trach care twice a day, every day. Yep. Ellen loved to help with that. Yeah. She actually, for people with G-tube babies, there's a nonprofit organization where you can get a stuffed animal with a G-tube on it for your child. And if your child happens to be trached as well, you can request that they also put a trach on the stuffed animal. And they'll give you one free for your special needs child. You can also buy some for the siblings if you want. So we got one for Dean and we paid for one for Ellen. And Ellen used to sit alongside with her bear with the trach and the G-tube and do care on her bear while we did care on Dean. We used like a cardboard box to make her a pretend suction machine, but with some of Dean's real tubing and a suction catheter so she could suction her bear. And we had another smaller cardboard box that was the feeding pump with the real feeding bag tubing so that she could feed the bear. And it was the cutest thing I've ever seen. And when she got a little bit older, she would help. And one of her favorite ways to help, Dean hated trach care. And she was one of the ones who could help calm him down by talking to him or singing to him while we got through trach care.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. They were great together. Yeah. So he was doing a lot better. I mean, the seizures were not good. We had trouble getting the seizures under control. We never actually managed it.
Okay.
He would have clusters of seizures. He'd be fine for like a month with nothing. But then when he had one, they would just keep going for like 24 to 48 hours. And initially his seizures were tonic seizures. He would just get real stiff and freeze like this. And he was not cognizant during his seizures. He had partial complex seizures.
Okay.
We were able eventually to come up with a good medication regimen for stopping a cluster in its tracks. So like once he had the first one, we could administer these meds to prevent him from having more. And that worked fairly well, but we could never get him to not come in the first place.
Yep.
That we never could do. When Dean was 12 months old, he started having apneic seizures, where he stopped breathing during his seizures. The first time that happened, I was holding him. He was calm but awake. We were just kind of hanging out, and we were in his room, and the nurse had gone downstairs to get his feed ready, his next feeding ready, and Dean just stopped breathing. And I flipped out, obviously, like my kid stopped breathing.
Yeah.
So like I was like screamed at the nurse. She ran upstairs. She called 911. We didn't know what to do. I think we would have bagged him. We had all of the stuff to bag him because he had a trach. So we would have bagged him, but he actually started breathing again fairly quickly. It lasted maybe like 20 seconds. So, the nurse had been downstairs. So like by the time she came upstairs and, was gathering everything, he had already started breathing again. But we still called 911 and they came and took him to the hospital. And nobody could say why he had stopped breathing. But he was fine and we went back home.
Okay.
Well, this kept happening. He kept having these like periods where he would just stop breathing for short times. So I was pretty sure that it was related to his seizures, but the neurologist didn't think so, because he said that while it was technically possible to stop breathing during a seizure, it was extremely rare and he had never seen it. And he said that what commonly happens, because once Dean got trached, he had to be on a pulse oximeter just to, make sure his oxygen was okay. Right. So he was hooked up to this, and so he would desat during these episodes. And the neurologist was like, well, during seizures, it's common for a child to desat because the oxygen gets diverted to the brain. And so it's not on the toe where the pulse oximeter is reading, which I get. That makes sense. And yes, he had always desatted during his seizures.
Okay.
Previously, he still breathed.
Right, exactly.
And I'm explaining to him, like, no, you don't, like, he has actually stopped breathing.
Right.
And the neurologist believed us that he was having these periods where he stopped breathing. He just wasn't convinced that it was related to his seizures. He thought it was a pulmonology issue. So we're sent to the pulmonologist, and the pulmonologist didn't think it was a pulmonology issue. She thought it was a neurology issue. So this keeps happening. At some point, we were at a routine doctor's appointment, and this happened. And the doctor witnessed it and was like, oh my God, that's not okay, and sent us straight to Dell Children's. And they got him hooked up to an EEG. Yep. And actually managed to catch an episode where he stopped breathing, proved it was a seizure.
Okay.
So apneic seizures, yay!
Add it to the list.
Like I said, there was always another shoe to drop. This was our whole life. The good news was his seizures were super short. They were usually 30 seconds and done. And so even if he stopped breathing for 30 seconds, while it was super duper scary and he would turn gray and he would desat, it was not technically harmful, according to the neurologist. Like, no damage was being done to the brain for that short period of time.
Okay.
So it still was okay. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Till the day that he had a 5-minute apneic seizure.
Oh, yeah.
This day, he had a seizure, he stopped breathing, and it just wouldn't end. We had a protocol for that. We had never needed it, but we had rectal Diastat to give in the case that he had a never-ending seizure. The protocol was that at the 5-minute mark, if he was still having a seizure, to give the Diastat. And this is after having already given all the other rescue meds. So we had given all the rescue meds. Do I need to pause?
Hold on just a second. I'm going to pause it for just a second.
Yep.
Sorry. Okay, back ready. Okay. Sorry, Tim was trying to tell me something. Okay.
I understand. So we had given all of his rescue meds. The seizure had not stopped. So at the 5-minute mark, we gave the Diastat. We also were calling 911 by this point because he's having to be bagged all through this because he's not breathing. So the nurse is just sitting there breathing for him.
Okay.
And so, we've called 911. The Diastat did bring him out of the seizure, thank goodness. He got sent to the hospital, but again, he was okay and he got released and sent back home. But now we knew that was possible.
That's scary. Yeah. Did you guys have night nurses as well?
Oh yeah. Okay. I should talk about that. Okay. When he got his trach,
I think you froze.
One-on-one nurse with them the whole time. And if he was going to have a one-on-one nurse anyway, there was no reason to be at the daycare.
Right.
So he stayed home from then on. So daycare lasted all of a month. Okay. But between the hospital stays, he really only spent like a month there. Okay. But anyway, so he was home. We had nursing, but it was not 24/7 nursing. Okay. You get assigned like so many hours based on the severity of the case. Dean was not on a ventilator at the time. That came later. There was always another shoe. That came later. He was not on a ventilator at the time. So we didn't have full nursing. So we chose to use our nursing hours at night. So we had nighttime nursing and some amount of daytime nursing. And otherwise I was home taking care of him. Okay. So once he started having the apneic seizures, he got 24/7 nursing. Okay. Because at that point it was clear that he could stop breathing at any moment and he needed a nurse at all times.
Right. Somebody had to constantly be watching him. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So that was when he qualified for 24/7 nursing. But nursing was a whole nother ordeal.
Exactly. That's a whole other challenge, just finding the right nurse and
finding any nurse, it turns out. We got ditched by our first nursing agency because they couldn't staff Dean because he was too hard. Because he was hard, he was complicated medically, and he was hard to console. Right. And so in the beginning, we had so much trouble getting nurses. And without the nurses, it was just me. I would sleep in his room on a pad. No, actually, during this time when we had like almost no nurses, we moved his crib to our room. Right. And we had a pack and play in our room. We had a crib in his room. We put all of his like suction equipment and pulse ox machine and all of that on a rolly cart. And he would sleep in the pack and play if it was just me, and the cart would be rolled into my room. if we got lucky and we had a night nurse, we would roll the cart to his room and he would sleep in his crib and the nurse would take care of him there.
Right. Wow.
But, I woke up to every sound, because the pulse ox would beep all the time, right? Like, you kick too much and the pulse ox is beeping, but you have to make sure he's not having an apneic seizure.
Right. Suction's not quiet. And
yeah. Well, and that was the other thing. He was a constant suctioner.
Yeah.
Like, when he was healthy, Dean healthy, he had to be suctioned like at least every 30 minutes. When he was sick, it could be every 10 seconds.
Yep.
Now that I'm in nursing school, like, we covered suctioning and they're all like, you shouldn't suction more frequently than, and I was like, that is so not a thing. I was like, you guys do not get it.
Wow.
Like, we didn't suction Dean every 10 seconds. He was just going to suffocate on his own secretions. Like, so that was amusing to me. And also a little bit frightening that nurses are taught that, because that is not a thing for some kids.
Okay. Yeah. It's the nursing world that tells you suction 3 passes and that's it. No more. Yeah, they've never met a kid that actually needs to be suctioned.
Yep. That's what I learned. But we did eventually, so our nursing agency ditched us. They told us, like, they why did
it look again?
And in October. So we're looking for a new agency, but we didn't know what to do or who to go to. Once he got trached, Dean was admitted to CCC, Comprehensive Care Clinic, which is a clinic that only takes care of complex cases. You have to be referred in by a doctor. So when Dean was in the hospital getting trached, that's when he got referred into that clinic.
Okay.
And when our nursing agency ditched us, his pediatrician at the clinic, combined with the doctor, or the nurse rather, at Trach Clinic, combined with, I think, like parent to parent maybe, all got together and consulted about Dean and where would be the best nursing agency, and gave us a recommendation.
Okay.
And so we went with that. But because it was October, they told us that they were not going to be able to staff us until January, because they would not be able to hire nurses during the holidays.
Oh, okay. That's a long time to go.
Indeed. During those months, we convinced the first nursing agency not to drop us completely. We only had one nurse who was willing to come out at that point, but we convinced them to let him keep coming out until this new agency could staff us. Now, this nurse was not ideal. He fell asleep on the job all the time. He's a night nurse, and we caught him sleeping all the time. But we were that desperate for help that it was still better to have this nurse who fell asleep on the job than to have nobody.
Wow, that says a lot. Yeah.
And he would come, 2 or 3 days a week. And that was all the help we had for those months.
Yeah.
But once we did finally get switched to the new agency, they were wonderful. They were able to staff us pretty much 24/7. We always had help. We went through a lot of nurses. Dean was still a really hard case. We didn't always have a nurse who wanted to work there. We had still problematic nurses that we had to replace for various reasons, sleeping on the job being one of them, but not the most significant one. We had some nightmare situations that I won't go into, but it's a thing.
Yeah.
But overall, it was much better.
Good.
Yeah. So I don't even know what happened from there on, like, in terms of his, like, after that, it's all a blur, his history. But what I remember is that he started getting respiratory infections all the time. Pretty much every month, he would get diagnosed with tracheitis. He'd end up in the hospital because he couldn't breathe. We'd be there for, 3 to 5 days, usually on a ventilator while he was there, until they could get all the antibiotics in him to clear up the infection and send him home. But this kept happening like every month. And so the pulmonologist we had been seeing, we wanted to try something else. Like nothing was working. And we had heard that you could do inhaled antibiotics to control this, because he was always getting tracheitis with Pseudomonas.
Toby
It's the name of the bacteria.
Yep.
And our pulmonologist was unwilling to try that. He didn't believe in it. He said he didn't think there was enough evidence to support it, and he didn't want to try it. So we switched pulmonologists because we had to do something.
Yeah,
So we switched to a different pulmonologist in the same practice who was willing to try that.
Okay.
We got him on these inhaled antibiotics, but you do it every day for a month, every other month. Because you can't go continuously because you'll build up resistance.
Yep.
So the inhaled antibiotic worked great.
Good.
During the months that he was on it. So now Dean was in the hospital every other month with tracheitis in the off months. So she got us on a second inhaled antibiotic, and we alternated back and forth month to month. That worked. By the way, during this time, because he was like constantly in the hospital with these infections, and every time he was admitted, he had to be put on a ventilator, they finally sent a ventilator home.
Okay.
They told us just to put him on the ventilator at night, every night, to give him just extra support so that when he did get sick, he was not starting from a place of tired from work of breathing.
Right.
And when he did get sick, then we switched him to 24/7 ventilator support to help him get through that so that we wouldn't have to go to the hospital. And that was very effective. That helped a lot. So
Good.
even though he was getting these infections still like every other month before we got both antibiotics when we were on just the one, he was getting these infections every other month, but we weren't having to go to the hospital every time because we were managing with the ventilator at home.
Okay.
But then they got him on the back and forth, and he did so much better. He stopped getting the infections it would be like once every, a few months, 3 or 4 months would go by. And so Dean turned 3. And at 3 years old, you are officially qualified to start preschool at the local elementary school. It's called PPCD, Preschool Program for Children with Disabilities.
Yep.
And we wanted to send him to school. We wanted him to have that experience, and he was not sick all the time. So we thought, he'll do great. His birthday though was in February, and so that's cold and flu season. So we couldn't send him
right away. Yeah.
Yeah. So we waited till April, but then we sent him to school, and it was just a half day, but he loved it. He was just doing so great. He was in a excuse me. He was in a wheelchair, and because he did, by the way, like when he was 15 months old, he started being able to roll over. So he learned how to roll back to tummy and tummy to back at 15 months, but he still never could sit up on his own. He couldn't, even if you put him in a sitting position, he couldn't maintain it. His muscle tone just fluctuated too much.
Yeah.
And he never learned to crawl, though he tried his little butt off. He would lay on his belly, and his arms would be flailing around like this, and he would manage to get like a knee up, and he could kind of shove himself forward with his knee on his belly. But he could never like get his belly up off the floor. So he couldn't like crawl, but he could sort of a little bit army crawl.
That's
a little bit. But he tried all the time. It was like one of his favorite activities was to just roll over onto his tummy and do his thing trying to crawl. He wanted to go places. But he got to go to school. The therapists, he had PT, OT, and speech therapy throughout his life. And at school, they have those therapists there as well. And so he would get them at school, and then we supplemented more at home. Okay. And so he would work with the therapist at school. He was in a classroom with other children with disabilities. Dean was by far the most complex, but You know, the teachers, there are multiple teachers in there, and they'd help him do like craft projects. And um, Ellen was in pre-K at the time, so she was at that local elementary school too. And the pre-K and the PPCD classes had recess and lunch together.
Aww.
And so Ellen used to show Dean off to all of her friends. And one thing that was cool was the teachers, Dean's teachers, took lots of pictures of him at school, and they were always sending me pictures. And so I have like pictures of all of Ellen's friends like in a circle around Dean, and Dean's got this big little smile on his face, and at recess.
Loving it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Aww.
And one thing we'd been worried about was the noise of being at school, because Dean was really sensitive to noise. And it wasn't necessarily that all loud noise was a problem, but a lot of times loud noise was a problem. It depended on the specific noise.
Okay.
For example, fireworks, he thought were hilarious. He would just like laugh at the boom of the fireworks, which I thought was great. And I was thankful for, because I was hesitant to let him come watch fireworks, but
Right.
he thought it was hilarious. But if we would go to like the Trail of Lights at Christmas, you know, they've got all the noise and the music going, and he hated that.
Okay.
He just was miserable. And we tried that a couple of different times, and he was miserable. So one thing we actually did was got him headphones to help block the noise. And we did that ahead of him going to school, just in case the noise at school became a problem. And
Okay.
the part I was worried about was the cafeteria. Because you know, all the kids are there, right? And so we had his headphones available, but it turned out he thought the cafeteria was hilarious. And his teachers would send me messages where they were just cracking up because they couldn't believe how much Dean was just cracking up at the noise in the cafeteria. They had no idea what he was laughing at, why he was laughing, but he would spend the whole lunch hour just laughing his little butt off.
Aww.
Like every day. That was his favorite time. So turned out to be fine. But yeah, he thrived. He was just doing so great. And by this point, you know, he's 3 years old, right? So we've gone through 3 years of really, really rough.
Yeah.
And by this point, by the time he was in school, I felt like my kid had finally turned into the kid that he was always meant to be, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Like, he wasn't fighting infections all the time, you know, like he had all of his disabilities and all of his issues, but that's okay, because that was just Dean, right? That was just part of him. That wasn't getting sick. Getting sick was hard. That was the worst, you know? I mean, all of it was hard, but the illness was the worst. Right. And by this point, he was just doing so great. And we were so happy as a family. We were so happy. I do want to say also during this time where he was getting all these respiratory infections, we had started seeing an immunologist.
Okay.
Because the geneticist and the immunologist figured out that third little gene mutation that played a role in the immune system ended up with Dean having a primary immunodeficiency, which was why he was always sick.
Yep.
That's why he caught all the infections. I mean, a trach makes you more prone to the infections anyway, because you've got this extra like entryway into the body. But I mean, Dean was excessive, and it was because he just didn't have a functioning immune system.
Okay.
But the antibiotics were working. You know, he was doing great. Here's where we get to the hard part of my story, because the rest of it wasn't hard. Bear with me. Dean had been at school for 2 months and was doing great. And he, at home, developed an illness, because this still happens sometimes. And sometimes his illnesses kind of progressed, but more often than not, they just kind of hit really fast. Like, he'd go from being fine to being really not fine pretty quickly. And this was one of those cases. And in the span of 12 hours, he went from being totally fine to developing a fever, not being able to breathe, having to be put on the ventilator, and just passing out with sleep. Because when he would get really sick, he would just sleep. And while he was asleep, he had an apneic seizure, and it was one that didn't end, and he did not recover from it. We ended up calling 911. He went to the hospital. He, in the ambulance, went into cardiac arrest. They resuscitated him, but he was not responsive to any stimuli in the hospital. They told us that all higher brain function was gone. Only his brain stem was functioning, which controls, just like breathing, basically, and your heartbeat. And that so he had hypoxic brain injury, so lack of oxygen to the brain because of the seizure. And that with this kind of injury, what we could expect was that over the next 72 hours, his brain was going to swell. And as his brain swelled, there was very likely going to be even more damage.
Yep.
And what happened was, by the end of the 72 hours, he went completely brain dead. And we had to disconnect him from the ventilator, and he died.
You guys were with him when he passed?
Yeah, he because he'd been in the hospital for 72 hours, so the whole family was there. But when we actually disconnected him, it was only Justin and me in the room. The rest of the family, including Ellen, was in the waiting room. And we held him like half on Justin's lap and half on my lap. And we were told that that he could die quickly or not as quickly, but he died immediately. I mean, he was brain dead. So once we disconnected the ventilator, he stopped breathing immediately and died. That was the end, which I'm thankful for, frankly. I didn't need it to be some drawn out agony.
No.
Obviously it was still agony.
Well, yeah. And it always will be. Yeah, it always will be.
But he died in our arms.
And he had a beautiful life. He really did. I've been lucky to see some of the videos of him laughing, and I did get to meet him, which I was very fortunate for that. And his smile was infectious.
He was an amazing kid.
He really was.
One of the things I actually really struggled with after he died was I no longer had my pick me up when I was sad. He was my happiness medicine.
Yeah.
And obviously I was sad all the time at that point, and there was just nothing. And I still had Ellen, and thank goodness for that, because I don't know if I ever would have recovered if it wasn't for having another child to force me to.
Right.
But it was rough because it was very unexpected, his death.
Yeah.
He, from the beginning, had not been expected to live long. Actually, when he was 2, we happened to be at a neurology appointment, and his neurologist had been with him since the day he was born. And his neurologist told me at this appointment that when he first met Dean, he didn't think he would make it 6 months. And he said that the only reason he was still thriving at 2 was because we were great parents. And that was really nice.
I think it's true. It says a lot. You guys did a lot to make sure that not only that he lived, but that he lived a good life.
We tried. We didn't want him stuck in a bubble. We wanted him to experience life. And so we tried to get out and do things. We couldn't travel at all, but we tried to get out and do things, and just help him experience as much as possible. He loved the outdoors. That was his favorite place. We have this big oak tree in our front yard that shades the grass. And so his favorite spot, his favorite pastime, was to just hang out on this blanket outside under the oak tree. And So one of our requirements when we were getting nurses for him was they had to be willing to just sit outside for hours at a time, because that's what Dean wanted to do.
Yep.
And if they were not willing to sit on the ground, and if they were not willing to be outside, they were not a good fit for our family.
Nope.
And so like we just would like keep a spray bottle on hand, and we just spray him down while he would hang out. And we have wind chimes, and then our oak tree, the grackles loved that tree. And so I told you he was real sensitive to sound. It went two ways. It wasn't just bad, it was also good. So he loved the wind chimes and the birds. He loved listening to them. And then he loved the feel of the grass on his feet. And that was funny because, the nurses, right, they're protective. So Dean would like scooch down on the blanket and he'd get his feet in the grass, and they'd be like worried about him getting dirty or whatever. And they'd pull him back up on the blanket, and he'd be like, what are you doing? Like, no. And he'd scooch right on back down. And if they would just leave him be, then he was perfectly happy. He just wanted his feet in the grass. And so that became a thing too. We had to like just tell all of our nurses, like, look, just let him have his feet in the grass. Like it's a thing. Just let it go. Then he was happy.
Oh, that's really cute.
Yeah.
Good.
He
go ahead.
used to laugh at like the smallest little noises. Like he thought this was really funny. And we figured that out because like when we had to do trach care twice a day, we'd hand sanitize, right? And so he would always laugh every time we had to sanitize our hands because he liked the sound of the hands rubbing together. He also liked the sound of Velcro. And then, like the paper on exam tables in doctor's offices, he'd love to like kick the crinkle paper and crinkle the paper. He thought that was great. And then he loved these little like music boxes. So at Dell Children's, there's some sort of organization. I don't even remember who it is, but they come by every few days and hand out toys to the kids there, toys and books. And, the books were okay because we could read Dean books and he enjoyed that, but most of the toys he couldn't really interact with. And they were just not that useful, but we knew he liked sounds. So one day on the toy cart, they had these little crank music box. And so that was what we picked. Oh, Ellen just brought me, my daughter's in here. She just brought me an example of one.
Hi.
So you just, you turn the crank and it plays the song. And so they brought one of those and Dean loved it. Loved it. And so that year for Christmas, Santa brought him a whole stocking full of little crank music boxes.
Oh, I love it.
He loved them.
That's so cool. And you still have them, and those are something that you can hold on to forever. Yeah. I love that. Oh.
Another thing about Dean, so he loved his music boxes, but his favorite thing on earth was his Binky, his pacifier. There's more music boxes. His favorite thing was his Binky, and he wanted it in his mouth at all times, all day.
Oh my gosh.
But he couldn't pick it up and put it in his mouth himself. He didn't have the coordination to do that. Or the vision. He also was visually impaired. I didn't even mention that. He also couldn't see. And so he needed help with the pacifier. And so what he would do is when it would fall out of his mouth, he'd go just searching for it until like somebody would drop it back in and then he'd be happy again.
Oh my gosh.
And we used to crack up at that.
Like a little fish. Yeah.
Yep.
I love it.
Ellen has just brought Kion from the Lion Guard.
He also liked that.
Aww.
This is important because Dean had trouble communicating, especially with the trach, but even aside from that, he didn't have the coordination for hand signals either.
Right.
He did eventually pick up 2 hand signals. The first and clearly the most important was Binky. He would put his hand to his mouth when he wanted his Binky. The second one is he would do this for more if he wanted more of something.
And he could also touch his head whenever.
He did learn how, like we could say, Dean, where's your head? And he would touch his head. But because he struggled with communication, his occupational therapist spent a lot of time working on alternative communication techniques. And so he had these like buttons that he could press to say like yes, for example. So you could ask him a question and he could press the button to say yes, or something like that, right? Or you could give him a list of choices and tell him to press the button when he got to the choice he wanted. We worked with him on this a lot, and some days it went better than others. He didn't always, it was clear that he was capable. He understood what we were telling him. That much was obvious. Oh, honey, okay, I need you to stop talking, please. I know, that's what I'm getting to, baby, okay? I'm going to tell my story. Sorry. But he understood what we were telling him. That was clear. It was just responding back that was hard. And some days he was just too tired to be bothered to push the button. But when he was coming up on his 3rd birthday, I wanted to throw him a themed party. And I didn't know what theme to do because it's hard to know what to do for a kid like Dean. Yeah. He couldn't watch TV, but Ellen watched a lot of TV. And a lot of the shows that Ellen watched, because Dean couldn't see it, right? But a lot of the shows that Ellen watched were musical, and Dean loved the music in the shows. So for his birthday, I gave him this list of options for a theme, and I had like a tablet with pictures of them, and I would show him the picture, because his vision wasn't totally gone. It just wasn't all the way there, right? If that makes sense.
Yep.
So I don't know how well I could see the pictures, but I would show him the pictures anyway and tell him what they were and say, Dean, do you want that one? And he had a button to push when we got to the one he wanted. And one of them was Lion Guard for the show, because he always seemed to enjoy that music. So we're going through the options, and Lion Guard, I think, was the second option I gave him. And he very clearly pushed the button for that. And he didn't push it for any of the others. So at the end, I said, Dean, I'm pretty sure you told me that you want Lion Guard for your birthday party. Is that right? To make sure that we're right, let's just go through the options one more time and push the button for the one you want. So we went through them a second time, and again, he pushed the button for Lion Guard and only for Lion Guard. And that was the first time that I felt like he really made his own choice and communicated it to me. And I threw him the best Lion Guard birthday party. We bought the Lion Guard soundtrack to have that going in the background, and all the decorations were just the whole works. And we bought Dean a t-shirt that was Kion t-shirt with a headband for Kion's little ears. Aww. And so we dressed him up as Kion for his birthday, for his 3rd birthday. And he had the best time. He laughed so hard.
And he loved the frosting on his cupcake.
Yeah, Dean couldn't eat, but we would give him little tiny tastes at special occasions. And so we gave him a little taste of the icing from his cupcake, which he thought was pretty great. And that was a good day. And that was good because like his 1st birthday, for example, was a disastrous day because we had thrown him a party for that day too. And as the guests started arriving, he started having seizures, and we couldn't get them to stop, and we'd had to go to the hospital. And that was his 1st birthday. Yeah. So obviously that was big letdown. I was in tears, right? Like that was rough. Yeah. But his 3rd birthday, man, that one was amazing.
Wow. I love that. Oh, thank you so much for sharing Dean with
me. Yeah, I'm glad.
He was, like I said, just an awesome kid, and his big sister running around behind you somewhere was his sister too. She always will be Dean's big sister. But I really appreciate you sharing your story.
Do you want to see a picture of him before we go?
Yeah, absolutely.
The one where I'm kissing him with the Easter basket.
While she's grabbing that, do you want to show your tattoo?
Oh yeah, I got, well, I don't know how well I can see it, but I got a tattoo. It says Dean, and it says my sunshine, because that's what he was to me. This was a recent picture. There's glare. Let me see if I can. Oh, that was worse. I don't know how to make the glare go away. There, is that better?
Me too. Oh.
So that was Easter. That was probably 2 months before he died. But that's Dean. And then I have one more picture. This one is older. He was younger in this one. But Ellen was holding him, and she was pretty happy to be holding him.
Aw, he's so cute.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna hit stop.